it was the most tangible example of this idea of the experience because clients would feel it as well, right? Obviously, that their market perception as being a leading law firm, a leading service provider, was completely reaffirmed by that experience, by that personal experience, right? Again, it goes back to the consumer thing where the experience drives the brand. And in professional services, I think that sometimes people don't focus on that enough.
The branding in professional services is a system of signals that reduces perceived risk, reinforces client identity, and requires narrative framing to enable change within risk-averse institutions. Bob, would you please introduce yourselves? Give us a little bit more about yourself.
I'm Bob Robertson. I'm the current Chief Marketing Officer of Jakson Lewis, which is a 1,000 lawyer plus labor and employment boutique here in the United States. I've worked in a variety of different law firms leading business development and marketing teams. I've worked in leading national firms, in Wall Street firms. I worked at a firm that's part of the Magic Circle, also at a firm that was a regional player on the West Coast. So I've had lots of different experiences in legal. But interestingly enough, like many of us in legal, we've had a life prior to legal. And early in my career, I worked for a consulting firm that worked with retailers on positioning, branding, and strategy. And it was led by a man who was really super creative and really many ways ahead of his time. And he was one of the folks actually, while he was an executive at Dayton Hudson, who developed the Target stores that we all
Wow.
know and love, right? And I had a client as part of that consultancy. I was a very young strategic planning associate, that was the title. And I had a client, and that client was Montgomery Ward. I don't know if many of you remember Montgomery Ward, but it was a mass retailer here in the United States, very similar to Sears and J.C. Penney. And my specific project was to try to turn around the men's apparel business. And there was a lot of effort put into a repositioning of that business, everything from actually changing the mix, changing what the department looked like within these Montgomery Ward stores, and there were literally hundreds of them around the country. And a lot of effort put into sort of repositioning and, in a sense, rebranding of men's apparel. And I have to say that most of it didn't really do much of anything to change the trajectory of that brand. And when I thought about it, it really was based on two things. There was a lot of great thought, a lot of great messaging, a lot of great change in visual dynamics around the men's apparel business at Montgomery Ward. But there was an inconsistency around the experience for the consumer, right? They came into the Montgomery Ward store. The men's apparel business looked modern and new. The rest of it looked as old as it always was. And it was inconsistent. So the brand was not consistent with the experience overall. And, it had poor customer service and there was a whole bunch of stuff. It was very indicative of those kinds of stores at that time. And the other thing, which I think was more interesting, and we had some research done on this, is that the consumer no longer connected with the brand from the perspective of that individual's identity, right? Didn't enhance or affirm that consumer's identity. If anything, there were new prototypes, new store chains being developed, again, like Target and others, that provided that consumer with a different sense of connection, whether that be aspirational or not, right? To their identity. And the Montgomery Ward shopper was more and more not interested in the messaging and the cues that particular retailer gave off, right? And I became really fascinated with the idea that psychology and behavioral science is really very intrinsically tied to the concept of brand. Although when most people talk about brand, they think about visual identity. They think about colors. They think about messaging. What makes or breaks a brand is that experience. It's that identification with you and the brand. And it's interesting because it's clear to most people when you think about consumer products, right? The folks who are the Trader Joe shopper or the people who like to go to Starbucks, there's a clear sense of that identification, right? Or a clearer sense of that identification, but it's far more nuanced when it comes to professional services.
Yeah. For some reason, when it comes to the B2B branding or understanding how business, it is removed or there's a cautious about that, or risk involved in being a different or trying to say something else, which is understandable. But it is about that recognition is how the brands, B2B brands, really fit into the category. The reason why we are hired, we're talking about signals over words. It is really how people feel things that matters the more, if I may, and if we agree. So color, tone, space, and design act as a pre-rational cues and shape perception before any rational evolution happen. We feel much before we can rationalize it with our mind what's really happening.
Yeah, in all of those, actually, interestingly enough, we can look at it from an aesthetic perspective, right? We look at color, use that as an example. You could look at color purely from an aesthetic perspective, but color also touches on feeling, right? It's an old adage, and there's truth to it, that in legal, everybody wants to have blue and variations of blue. And we know that blue has certain attributes about trust, et cetera, from research. So yeah, that's understandable. So some firms go very into red, and that has a statement, of course. Our sort of advocacy, right? That kind of strength and advocacy, et cetera. And then some firms do the black and white kind of thing. What was legal, what was not, what could be structured, what couldn't be structured, that kind of thing. So we look at that, but I think I shared with you before this recording something that made me realize that colors have associations have deep sort of psychology. I can't even speak today. It's deep triggers psychologically, right? This is back in the 90s. I was working on a website redevelopment project at a firm. And what was very common and somewhat in vogue at the time was the combination of brown and blue. You saw it a lot in interior design. You saw it a lot of places, right? It was a thing. You saw it everywhere. And we were working with a developer in a trendy developer that didn't really work with law firms primarily and had a big Flatiron district studio here in New York. And they came up with a concept that was brown and blue. And I met with a senior leader at that firm, and I thought I'm presenting various concepts, etc. So I'm presenting stuff. And all of a sudden, I was treated to about, I don't know, maybe it felt longer, but a 10-minute exposition about that individual's thoughts on the color brown. There was more thinking about the color brown, frankly, that I had ever given the color brown personally. But it was interesting because that color triggered something in that individual, right? And it was a psychological triggering. Now, I'm not placing a value judgment on it. I'm just saying that's what it was, right? And it was a negative connotation. And so they really felt almost had a gut reaction to it. So it's beyond aesthetics, right? It's about psychology. It's about how people react to color and what it brings out. And you see this in other it's why law firm websites don't have neon across, because the connotations of that, which are super creative, super outside the box, super daring, if you want to use that word, right, doesn't really align with the kind of stability that most law firms want to portray.
So that makes perfect sense because in financial services, I would say even some engineering and law firms are, I won't say utility, but there's certain expectations that the service is going to be provided a certain way in terms of norms. I think that's where that stigma of the changing colors or using different color that might be positioned differently, there's not that much, I think, need. How many shades, how many kinds of blue we have? There's
Right.
hundreds of kinds of blue.
Right.
When you really look deep in it, there's quite a bit of the blue that we can choose from, right? My experience working with financials is like how different you really have to be. It's not how different you really want to be, how to have to be to position the brain properly. So that was my learning.
And I think that it's interesting because what I've learned, I think, around professional services branding is that the brand obviously has all of these subtle cues around it, cues around the third-party validation, cues that touch on obviously alignment with the individuals it markets to from a identity perspective, but also I think the brands exist and really flourish in connection with how people experience it, right? That's what reaffirms it for people. And what does that mean? So I'm going to share with you a story that I think illustrates it to a point, but I think it actually does a good job of putting it in the law firm context. I was recently invited to a CMO roundtable that was hosted by a firm that everyone would know. It's a probably considered to be one of the gold standard law firms in the United States. It's known for its legal acumen and its high level of client service and for its connectivity, right, with obviously policymakers, with regulators, with boards, et cetera. So it has that whole kind of corporate aura from a brand perspective. And what made it distinct for me was actually the experience of it, because I knew all about that before ever setting foot in their offices. But what happened now, of course, I'm not a client. I'm a CMO of another law firm sitting there at a roundtable discussion. But I am greeted at reception downstairs by someone who takes me into the elevator and brings me up to the floor, where I'm greeted by yet again someone else who takes me to the conference room and sits me down and asks me if I need anything. I walk out a couple of times to go to the restroom or whatever it is. And there are lawyers in the hall, there are legals in the hall, there are assistants in the hall, whatever. But when they notice that I am not a member of the firm, they stop and ask me if I need anything, if they could help me. I was rather stunned by the whole experience,
Wow.
frankly, right? Because it was a high service culture, right? It was clearly people did. There was someone who was obviously a partner exiting a conference room, and I looked a little befuddled as to where I needed to go to find a restroom, to be blunt. And he said, "Oh, let me take you there." And
Wow.
I was just floored by the whole experience. It was highly consistent with my understanding of that brand, right? And more to the point, when lunch is served, I know this is going to sound silly, but trite, it's an incredible spread, right? Really lovely spread that the firm is paid for people who really aren't their clients, just guests in their space, right? And it was the most tangible example of this idea of the experience because clients would feel it as well, right? Obviously, that their market perception as being a leading law firm, a leading service provider, was completely reaffirmed by that experience, by that personal experience, right? Again, goes back to the consumer thing where the experience drives the brand. And in professional services, I think that sometimes people don't focus on that enough. But that is really part of it. For us, where I'm at right now, I'm sure I can say this, but clients love working with our lawyers. It's an amazing thing because so often we do client interviews and you expect to hear mixed stuff. But what you hear consistently is that they really like the partners they work with. They like them. There's a connection, right? And it's that what makes up the brand, right? It's not the words on paper. It's that
So
experience.
I was part of rebranding of Starbucks, and there's some stark evidence came in. I know this is we're taking a conversation somewhere else, but I'm basically making pretty much same point that the Starbucks being perceived specific way is like a high-end coffee, paying a lot for it, and it's like a coffee coming from somewhere else, exotic places, and it's being served certain way, and there's all sorts of different things. So the economic value of the coffee that you're getting from Starbucks is what is mostly perceived as the value that's coming from Starbucks. The matter of fact is that true value of the Starbucks is really coming from trained barista. And when I
Hmm.
say that, most of the people react same way. Oh, yes, that's right. That's it. Because you can being served coffee and you'll be like, okay, coffee is good coffee. I understand it's good coffee. But when somebody comes and really knows what he's doing with the coffee and it's polite and highly trained, I know that because I did a study, those guys are, even we take them for granted, they're highly trained to deal with a number of different things, deal with customers, difficult customers, and they do really good job consistently across the globe, right? That's a global brain. So that's what really Starbucks is about. It is your personal relationship with barista. And the coffee
Yeah.
is just like, oh yeah, the coffee, yeah, amazing coffee. I hate doing this, but it's mostly like it's not what it is; it's really how they treat you. So that irrational part of the brain of the business is by far more important. I was just listening presentation about somebody trying to save money, making more robots replace these, making more automated service and all that, but it doesn't move the needle in a customer review. except when it
Yeah,
comes
because
to
if you stop and think about it, the coffee itself is expensive, relatively speaking, right? To what it is. And what are you paying for is the experience. You're paying for the barista. You're probably paying for the experience of sitting in the cafe on your laptop and not being bothered, right? You're paying for all of these ancillary things around it, right? And that is, again, in a nuanced kind of way, what happens in professional services. You are paying for the experience of the firm in terms of giving you that kind of assurance, right? That you're navigating these issues appropriately, et cetera. But you're also paying for the value adds, the introductions you might have, the in is certain kind of elite practices, the insights you might have because the lawyers might have been former regulators or former policymakers or government officials and stuff, so they have insights from that world, right? So it's a whole bunch of things that make up that brand.
So how do you think customers really choosing the brand? If I'm let's strip down reputation and really not knowing the what I'm trying to remove is a memory. We don't know much
Right.
about law firms, like how somebody who is not really engaged in a law firm, so how they choose a law firm.
In terms of a corporate law firm, because that's what I could speak
Corporate
to,
law
right?
firm,
Yeah.
yes, that's right.
I think they speak how they choose is interestingly enough for years, and I think it's still the case, that peer referral is one of the primary drivers. It's a lawyer selection. It's been that way for years, and it still is. And along with peer referral, you get its cousins, which are like third-party endorsements from directories and awards and stuff like that, right? But peer referral trumps it all. And if you stop and think about it, that's a very personal thing, right? It's
Mhm.
one person recommending another firm, recommending a firm to another. And obviously attesting to the quality of the lawyers, attesting to the quality of the services provided, but attesting to the quality of the relationship, right? And that I think is one of the primary ways people choose. Now they choose also because their understanding of that firm, again, through either information in the market, peer information, competitor information, just buzz in the market about the firm, and their experience of the firm as it speaks about itself, its work, its presence in the industries and in the circles that matter to those clients, right? All of that plays a role in that decision making. It also, and we touched on this a little bit, for certain types of practices and certain types of buyers, the connection between identity and the law firm is important. I'm going to take it outside of this context. I'm going to provide it. I'll give you another example. I worked once at a very elite law firm, and it really was a very elite law firm, one of the leading ones in the world. And the lawyers at that firm are considered some of the most prominent practitioners in their areas of law globally, and they're recognized for that. There was some discussion about hiring a consultant for that firm. And what was fascinating about that discussion is that in our space in legal, there are a plethora of great consultancies that do great work for law firms. But in evaluating who would be the consultant that they would use, none of those firms were considered.
Oh, wow.
The only firms that were considered were the McKinseys, the Boston Consultants, the Bains, right? They were the only ones to be considered because those were the only firms that, in the view of the firm, actually affirmed and in some cases enhanced the self-perception of that firm, right? Of those buyers. Because going down marketing, I'm going to put it that way, but I guess, wouldn't be appropriate to the identity, right? It
Yeah.
wouldn't be a comfortable choice. Although most people would say they would probably a good choice. They're smart people everywhere, right? You don't have to
Oh,
go
yeah.
you don't have to go to Landorf or Interbrand for branding, right? You can find it everywhere. But it's that brand perception and identity piece. And for some types of work, that's important. And for some buyers, that's more important than others. It has to align with themselves and how they view themselves in the market.
So, in your perspective, we're talking about reputation here. Like reputation means identity, but
Right.
in one word, even that I haven't thought about reputation for a very long time, this is a good time to use it. How is that reputation is really built in your vast experience, Bob? How the companies, law firms get that prestigious reputation or certain kind of reputation? If they don't want to be prestigious, they can be inclusive law firm.
Prestige Reputation is interesting. It's built on a number of things. Obviously, in a law firm, it's the partners that are in the building, right? The lawyers that are in the building, and the quality of those lawyers. It's really a very important piece. The cues around quality historically in some firms have been around education, right? Where do these people get recruited from? Where do they go to school? For elite practices, that's super important, right? What roles did they previously play, et cetera. So reputation is built on the lawyers, but more than anything, reputation is built on the work and promotion of that work. If, for example, you're an M&A lawyer, your reputation really hinges on two things: your ability to actually get the deals done and your reputation within the deal making community, but more than anything, the deals you've done, right? What have you done? The complexity of those deals, the industries those deals have been done in. So, as a law firm, if you're working in a practice like that, it's really to amplify the information around that work in every way possible through media, through rankings, through awards, whatever, because the work really really enhances reputation. It used to be that I think civic involvement played a role. I think, frankly, that not as much anymore, as many of these firms have become truly global in nature and not tied to any specific city or place. But traditionally in New York, for instance, you had firms building reputation through their philanthropy, right? Whether or not but that is a weaker way
Yeah.
nowadays for a variety of reasons than it once was. But I think really what it does, it's the work, it's the quality of lawyers, it's the connectivity or the proximity to other individuals that matter. And I put it that way, but let me explain what I mean. It's their proximity to business leaders and boards, right? It's their proximity to CEOs. It's their proximity to people in government, or that also builds reputation because that can be demonstrated by the fact that people in government might be, for example, partners in the firm, right? They transitioned into your firm, or they're former GCs of companies, or former partners became GCs, right? It's this perception around their part in the fabric of business, if you want to look at it that way.
So let me ask you this question. What is in that field, particular field, or in a broader field that you are
Yeah.
participating in, have experiences? Such a resistance to change any sorts of any kind. It's like a being perceived visual. Well, let's not even talk about visual identity, but any kind of change being perceived as with a lot of resistance. Branding world has to fit, and there's no disruption. It has to be institutionalized to reduce the risk, and the sensitivity of the more senior people in the company is really where it comes to the push of that willingness to change, if you will.
It varies from firm to firm. The willingness to change and the ability to change varies from place to place, right? But there is an underlying thread that people don't want to do things too way out of the box, right? In that is basically, you touched on it when you talked about the feeling of safety, right? The feeling of comfort, because that's basically what we give clients, that they're going to be fine, they're going to get the deal done, or they're going to be able to succeed at a litigation or whatever, right? And once you do certain things, you figure out what works, right? And you don't want to put at risk those signals, right? That perception that you are a safe place, that you are an authoritative place, right? And when you start doing things that are unusual, right, you take risks
Yeah.
and you are in a risk adverse environment. So by nature, those things have a certain level of resistance. It's not that they never can be done because people have
I
taken
mean,
risks.
to all what you're saying is why would we signalize any change if there's no true change? We signalize change only when we have to change something, right? Why? So that there's that. I'm answering my own question.
There is a need to change because they need to change certain things because the need to change because the competitive environment has gotten much more aggressive, right? And also how signals play out are different, right? The it's today's buyer for legal services may not identify as well with certain things that buyers in the past identified with.
Yeah, yeah.
A silly example, which I'll give you, is that law firms, many large law firms, corporate law firms, invested very heavily at one time in their lobbies of their office buildings,
Yes.
in their offices, right?
Yes.
You'd walk in and in some cases, not all cases, but in many cases, especially the larger, more prestigious the firm, the lobby
Mhm.
was an amazing thing. That was once I entered a lobby of a firm that had done a huge renovation. It was not a firm I worked for, but I was there for another reason. And oh my God, it looked like the Acropolis. It was just amazing. The white marble, what kept going on forever, right? And it was intimidating, imposing. Again, what did it signal? Strength, right? Stability, authority, but signaled all those things from a psychological perspective. You walked in and you felt that you were part of something bigger than yourself. But today, in the Zoom Teams world we live in, that signal doesn't matter as much anymore.
Oh, so that was my question.
Yeah.
So what are the trends? What do you see are the new symbols that signifying establishment, reputation? We live in a significant disruption of institutional disruption, geopolitical, and on top of that, we have a lot of technology that is accelerating. How that affects the entire field? It's really interesting to
Well,
hear.
there's a conversation around the connection between brand and innovation that's taking place, right? Innovation, AI. It's that is becoming more of a signal. It's interesting because I read a study recently that talked about what lateral partners were considering as part of their move, right? And traditionally, it's been all about I'm going to make a shortcut and say it was mostly about platform. How can I go to a firm that will help me develop my business more effectively, right? What platform does its platform enhance me, right? And that's been at the core of it, one of the primary drivers. What's interesting about the study seems to indicate that the perception of the firm on the innovation curve has now become an important criteria. Now, that could mean nothing. That can mean a lot of things, right? But is because, again, we're talking about perception necessarily reality, although, as the old story goes, perception is reality, right? But innovation and the embrace of technology is now becoming an interesting
Yeah.
a brand differentiator, especially as AI has become ubiquitous, right? Everywhere. The concept of AI, at least not AI, but the concept of it becomes ubiquitous. And so it's not only the reputation and the work, but now it's technology. It's about innovation. It's doing things differently, right? Again, with the same quality results. So it's an interesting thing that's happening.
I'm really curious if you want, when you say doing things differently, we just spoke about that, about
Right.
traditional,
Right.
institutionalized practice. When you say different, how different is different and what is a
How
different?
different is different is a really interesting question because technology and tools have the ability to really transform legal practice, but it's way in, I think it's still a promise rather than a reality at this point. But I think the buzz around being open to considering different ways of doing legal research or being open in terms of doing applying different ways of doing document review in discovery or applying it in different aspects of the service delivery. That is what gets you recognized, right? Whether or not you're, for example, it's interesting. Many firms have benefited from the fact that they've served as incubators for legal tech startups. Some of the large firms, like I think it was Allen Overy and Harvey, right? And they get the residual benefit of that perception, although perhaps
Mhm.
the actual what the day to day hasn't been transformed that much, or at least it wasn't at that point, right? So there's all this kind of residual benefit that firms have to being considered to be adjacent to technology, if you want
Mhm.
to use it. Maybe that's better put that way, right?
Cool.
Does that make sense?
I love it. I love it. I have heard about lab, but very cool. Thank you. Last thing, do you have any questions for me?
Yeah, I think so. I think from where you spent a lot of time thinking about behavioral science and branding and stuff like that. What are some of the key principles that you've established as part of your practice, your branding practice, that you think are universal in nature, can be applied in the professional services context as well, with things to think about or things to really delve and explore further?
I obviously have answer. There's a two things. There's a two things that two forces, and a third one put them together. The
Right.
first force is that system promotes the behaviors, meaning if you're going to change behaviors, let's not change the players, let's change the system. On the other side is understanding the customers at not what they're saying, but what they can say.
Right.
And that is understanding them at psychological level. And I'm always saying there's a logic that we say, logic, and there is psychologic that it has to be embraced. And as soon as we get into psychologic, we uncover probably 60% more of what is really this about. And if at that point of time, if system understand what's really happening, then we can really serve the customers better. And that I think that's the third part, which is the measure of the adoption of new behaviors. And new behaviors are actually an additional value proposition for the businesses. So we're having all these business value propositions that traditionally we're going through, and there's a adoption, new behavioral adoption value that is bringing. Oh my God, I'm such a nerd. But that's what it is. So there's the three parts: system, individual, and adoption that is actually measurable. These two things coming together.
Yeah, that's why it's interesting because I think in my own way I've come to the same conclusion that you have. That's why I like to focus a lot on the client experience piece of it. Because that is where I think a lot of the magic happens in terms of the brand, in terms of recognition, in terms of really enhancing the brand's perception. It's really in that example I just gave you about from that elite law firm that it's looking at the whole journey, right? The whole journey of that individual and their experience with that brand. I think it's still an area of great opportunity for law firms because I think that there are elements of it that exist. For example, a firm can be incredibly good at the experience as it relates to the legal services side of a house, but can't get it right when it comes to billing or collections or any of that stuff. And people tend to dismiss that a little bit, going, oh, yeah, we need to fix that. But what's interesting about it is that is a very dangerous signal because that sends a signal which is contrary to the other signal we're sending about the quality of the firm, right? So people experience the firm in very different ways. And just to even further that for a minute, when you talk to clients, generally, this is my experience among other firms, when they talk about the firm, the experience of the firm, they never limit it to just the lawyers. They talk about technology. They talk about, again, the infamous billing department, finance. They talk about the value-added offerings. They talk about a lot of things. They define experience very broadly, but we often, in firms, look at it very narrowly. But I think
Yeah.
we can learn from that because that
Yeah.
is the brand, is that full experience, not that just singular lane, right?
This was way out of my expectation. So thank you so much, Bob. This was lovely. It was lovely friendship that we developed. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's
For
been a
all
pleasure.
the
It's
time.
been a pleasure. It's been a
Thank
pleasure.
you.